Hello, Peter.
Hi, Bill. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am very good.
I'm sad to say that Matt Lewis will not be with us this week. I do enjoy my weekly chatting with Matt, but he has better things to do. Actually, I don't even know why he got cut out this week. Hopefully, I'll find out. He had delicious and salacious stories to tell when he returns. But thank you, Peter, for subbing in. I want you to tell the Twib audience, the blogging.tv audience, a little bit about yourself.
I am an associate editor at Reason Magazine. I blog regularly at Hit and Run, the Reasons blog, and I'm also an occasional contributor to theamericanscene.com.
So do you label yourself a libertarian or a conservative or both?
I am more of a libertarian than a conservative, but I have a bit of a history with more conservative groups, and I'm a little more sympathetic to them than maybe some libertarians.
Excellent. Hopefully we can explore all of these nuanced strains as we proceed. Well, first off, and you told me this is going to be of interest to you because you have Florida ties. The BP oil spill definitely got a lot of blog play on the left, and I was particularly noticing, maybe it's not surprising that obviously the reaction would be very strong and very negative to the company, but this interplays with the pending climate bill that Senators Kerry, Joe Lieberman, and the conservative Lindsey Graham have been working on, and is trying to put together a tenuous coalition. And part of that deal was always going to be a expansion of drilling in exchange for a cap on carbon. And you're not seeing in the progressive blogosphere a lot of appetite for such a compromise. You had the Washington Independent, Aaron Weiner, dinging Lieberman for seemingly shrugging off the tragedy, saying accidents happen. It's no reason to change one's mind about an expansion of drilling. You had Mary Landrieu hit by Brad Johnson at the Wonk Room. Mary Landrieu is probably the biggest champion of the oil industry on the Democratic side, saying, I'm not a handmaid to the oil industry, but I'll tell you this country uses 20 million barrels of oil a day. The last thing we need to do is shut the oil and gas industry down. Brad Johnson was somewhat mocking about that. So you have this potential of a further straining of this strange bedfellows coalition in advance of a climate bill coming forth, which might actually happen next week if some reports that Kerry and Lieberman are going to go forward, even though they don't have Graham's explicit endorsement yet. I take it the reaction on the conservative side is different.
Well, I think conservatives, libertarians, etc., aren't entirely sure what to do with this in some ways. It's obviously not something that conservatives and libertarians particularly benefit from politically to talk about. On the other hand, you can't ignore it. It's a huge story. It's going to have a huge impact. No matter, even if it has the smallest possible impact, the impact is going to be fairly large on the Gulf Coast, on the economy there. Like I said, like you said, I have Florida ties. My parents live on the Florida Gulf Coast, in around the Destin area. It's about an hour from Pensacola, and I'm hearing from them at least that a lot of the tourist industry that sort of keeps the town going during the summer is not sure really what they're going to be able to do this year. And if that shuts down for a year or for longer, that's a pretty big deal, especially if it spreads out across the Texas, Alabama, Florida corridor there and sort of hits the entire Gulf Coast.
So I think you're not seeing Marco Rubio doing what Sarah Palin is doing now and repeating the drill baby drill line, I take it.
That's not something that people are going to be saying a lot anytime soon. On the other hand, I have seen, it is something that is being talked about. Reason's Ron Bailey, I think, wrote a very good column on this this week. Looking at the cost benefit of drilling versus not drilling, arguing. I think persuasively he looked at a Georgetown study on just sort of on the broader cost benefit between drilling versus offshore drilling versus not drilling, but that also took into question sort of the potential environmental risks and attempted to price those. And that it's a really tough thing to do to sort of figure out liabilities here. And part of the problem, I think, was that BP's liability was limited to begin with, or at least they felt like it was. I guess it's turning out that the cap on their liability is going to be expanded or lifted. But this is, and in fact, this gets, sort of the broader issue involved in this, I think, is the one that is dominating domestic policy questions right now, which is how much risk are we going to allow individuals and corporations to expose themselves to, and how much of that are we going to socialize, for lack of a better term, move, to try to whisk away, try to soften using pools of government money or taxpayer money, and how much are we going to sort of let people do what they're going to do and then pay for it. In this case, I think one of the problems was that we ended up that we let BP drill, but also sort of said, look, you're not going to be liable in case some of the damages come here.
I think there's a wrinkle in the law, though, even though there's a $75 million liability cap on economic damages, indirect damages. If BP is found to be negligent, I think that cap is off the table, and then you can hit BP much harder.
Right, and and I think that to some extent we have to price those things in. We have to tell companies that they need to price these sorts of things in when they're doing these things. It's in order to we have to allow them to take the risks. I would say, on the other hand, we can't allow them to take the risks without expecting them to pay up when they fail, even whether or not it's negligent. And I think that that it's entirely possible here, and this is something that Bailey covered in his column. It's entirely possible. It's probably more likely that this wasn't malfeasance, that it wasn't negligence. What Ron wrote was, progress is a trial and error process, and increasing safety results from learning how to make better trade-offs over time between risks. Despite the current disaster, offshore drilling remains a risk well worth taking. And I think that's basically true, but we need to figure out how to price these risks appropriately and how to hold people accountable for the risks they take.
Well, are these libertarian approaches to this factoring in? Well, we accept that there are risks involved with this, but maybe there should be things like stronger safety regulations to minimize these risks that might not be. Joe Conason had a piece in Salon saying, Norway does offshore drilling too with a much better safety record because it's state-owned and they don't have loose regulations pawned off for private companies to do whatever. Now, no one's arguing, I think, on the U.S. side to make the oil industry entirely state-owned, but there's certainly talk about tougher regulations, and I think what we're going to see at least a Kerry Lieberman climate bill, you saw Kerry this week at the Blue-Green Alliance's Green Jobs Conference preview the bill, saying what they were going to do in regards to oil companies was to have pollution permits in regards to carbon emissions. And the proceeds from selling those permits would go directly to consumers. So it's a little bit different than a carbon cap as far as the elements of it, but apparently that will go a little easier on the oil industry than having a tougher cap would be, and you can try to politically sell it as being polluter pays, and the money is going into your pocket, you're not being taxed, but it would not scrap what Obama talked about earlier, which is an expansion of drilling in the Southeast Atlantic Ocean. Kerry is indicating on top of that you would have stronger regulations, safety regulations in response to this disaster. Is that something that libertarians or conservatives might embrace and saying, hey, it's not banning it, it's not saying we shouldn't do it, but it's acknowledging that there are risks involved and there is a government role to mitigate those risks?
Well, I think you're not going to see many sort of policy-focused libertarians embrace that sort of thing. I think it's the problem with safety regulations in an instance like this and in cases like this is that disasters like this are relatively rare and they are incredibly difficult to predict. And if we have what I suspect we have here, which is not a case of malfeasance or of ill intent or negligence,
well, we don't
but
know
instead
yet.
Right, we don't know, but I mean it's entirely likely. Either way, we have no idea, and we'll find out. But if we find out that this was simply an unforeseen problem, I mean, the thing broke through, I guess, 5 of the safety valves. It basically broke a quintuple backup plan. This isn't supposed to happen, and they had planned for for multiple breakdowns in the system, and it still did. And so, safety regulations can only go so far. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw from Republican politicians an embrace of increased safety regulations, simply because the political environment is so ripe for it. And it's going to be very hard to oppose that sort of thing, right?
As part of a broader global warming carbon cap bill?
Certainly, in order to sort of secure the offshore drilling that they had hoped to get. If you're going to have...
This was Graham's initial play.
Right.
Graham was saying, look, I know I can't get more drilling and more nuclear power with 41 Republicans, so I'm willing to deal with Democrats, give them the carbon cap so I can say I brought more drilling to South Carolina, more nuclear power to South Carolina, and I bet I can get a handful of Republicans to go along with me. Do you think is Graham right that there will be Republicans that will go along? That will there be conservative bloggers, to put this more into the the Week in Blog realm? Would conservative bloggers take that deal?
I suspect that most bloggers on sort of the who aren't most bloggers who are sort of on the right or on the free market side of things will not be particularly interested, though there will certainly be some.
I imagine you only need some to make it
right, and you only need a small number, and there will certainly be defenders who argue that this is the best deal that you can get, and you should take it. On the other hand, bloggers of all stripes, as we know, have the luxury of not having to deal with the practicalities of politics.
Right.
We can argue for what we believe is better policy, and I suspect that will be seen as a compromise, and therefore not particularly popular with those who are primarily concerned with what they believe to be better, purer policy.
Right. Beyond anything more to say about the oil spill?
No. Just that I thought Ron had about the right approach to it, Ron Bailey, and that it does sort of add yet another wrinkle and layer to the big question of how much risk are we going to allow individuals and corporations to expose themselves and others to.
So Matt Lewis is not here, but he was in the mix of a notable new media / blog story. We've noted, I think, in the previous segment, Dave Weigel was hired by the Washington Post. He used to be at Reason. He was at the Washington Independent covering the conservative movement blog style. And the Washington Post has hired him as part of their beefed up online component. Some conservatives had complained that while Weigel, has called himself a libertarian or conservative at times, has started taking a lot of pot shots at the conservative movement and at the Tea Party movement, and thought it was going to lead to a lot of unfair coverage. He tweeted in recent days that gay marriage opponents were bigots, and Matt Lewis wrote a story on Politics Daily. Washington Post reporters bigots tweet criticized by right, noting that Newsbusters was not impressed. I'm sorry, that Newsbusters was criticizing him when he was first hired. Matt Lewis said, perhaps Weigel will turn out 2 decades to appreciate, but bigot is awfully strong language for a person who's making the case for tolerance. And this comment simply reinforced a long-standing view among social conservatives that the Post and most of the rest of the mainstream media are not only implacably opposed to their policy agenda, but personally hostile to them as well. Weigel then apologized and said that he should not have called them bigots. First, I apologize by calling same-sex marriage opponents bigots. I was specifically referring to people who spend their working hours opposing gay marriage, not just people who vote to ban it. But those people aren't bigots either. But who's threatened by legal same-sex marriage? Whose life is made worse? If there was science suggesting that children raised by same-sex parents are worse off than children raised by traditional families, that'd be one thing, but I haven't seen it. We've watched legal same-sex marriage in several European countries and several states. It hasn't ushered in some decline in the quality of life or marriage. That's what I don't understand. That's my bias for now. I'll happily entertain arguments to the contrary. And I think Matt Lewis also noted that just making that kind of comment violates Washington Post policy for reporters. So it does raise questions about journalistic practice. But what do you think? Does this legitimately confirm conservative views that the media is out to get the Tea Party, or is it just a straight comment, part of the coin of the realm in opinion journalism and blog-style journalism, and not that big of a deal?
I think what it confirms is that no one has been able to successfully pin down Dave Weigel's politics for at least a year, perhaps longer than that. I've known Dave Weigel for a long time. I never worked with him at Reason. He left for The Independent before I came on, but he's a friend of mine. And I could not possibly classify him. The only policy position that he's come out for at all, as far as I can tell, in the last couple of weeks, was that he came out as basically pro-life. He believes that many abortions probably should be illegal, I think he said to the Politico. But other than and that's the sort of thing that actually social conservatives should be thrilled that they've got a pro-life guy covering them. I think pro-lifers are fairly rare in mainstream media jobs, especially sort of in the conservative beat positions. And so having somebody like that, you would think they'd be thrilled in a lot of ways. And the thing is, the question that Matt asked that I thought was really interesting, Matt Lewis in his piece, was, how can Dave now go to the Family Research Council's Values Voters Summit and objectively report on it? How can his coverage of a Rick Santorum speech be trusted? And this was the question that a lot of the right-wingers asked when Dave was hired, and that's been sort of going around. But my question is here, how does the tweet change what Weigel's going to say or think? If he hadn't tweeted that, he still would have thought that. And I think that it's sort of absurd to think that there's some mythical reporter out there who understands the conservative movement really, really well, as Dave does. He both has a great store of factual knowledge and an understanding of how the people within it think. And has no opinion on the major issues. That reporter doesn't exist. If you are a reporter, if you pay attention to these things, you're going to develop personal opinions. I'm not sure Dave's choice of the way he decided to express it was the best. And he apologized for the specific wording he used. But look, the fact that his opinion about supporters or those who oppose gay marriage came out isn't going to change what he was going to write about it anyway. And I think that Dave has proven to himself a fair and knowledgeable reporter over the years. Again, I'm totally biased as his friend of several years, but I mean, and I also think that his totally unclassifiable politics means that you can't lob the sort of the charge that he is just another liberal out to tar these folks. He talked about being sympathetic to the Tea Party movement and saying, look, I actually get where they're coming from.
Well, I assume
taxes are high, and things are
I assume his general approach to his chosen career path is, I want to give the conservative movement tough love and try to hold them to a higher standard. Not that he's trying to just go on a mission to bring them down.
I don't know if I would characterize Dave's approach to reporting like that, or anyway, I don't know exactly how I would characterize it. Again, he is sort of unclassifiable. I'm not sure whether it's tough love or whether he simply thinks that, look, this exists. I, as someone who is in touch with these people, am aware of it and understand it, and I can put it out there for other people to understand better because I have these connections and sort of this knowledge. And I think that it may be as limited as that, rather than tough love, rather than sort of the activist tough love. I want you guys to shape up. Simply, I have this information. I think other people are not getting this quite right, and I'm going to make an effort to get it right, which is the basic reporter job of a reporter, and I think Dave does it very well.
Well, the gay blog QueerT, it's like similar. I don't know if it's exactly what you're saying, but they wrote, it's Weigel's job as an ostensibly objective reporter to call the facts as he sees them, and if he sees bigotry, he is by all means responsible to identify it in his coverage. We need more journalists like him, willing to identify intolerance, hypocrisy, and outright lies. Like when the White House tells you one thing but does another, that is a lie, and the word lie should be printed, just like the word bigots when used to describe people actively endorsing discrimination should be used when the definition fits. So, I mean, and obviously, I'm sure, as Matt was saying, he doesn't think it is inherently bigoted to oppose gay marriage, although he acknowledged that maybe we'd have a different perspective on it 20 years down the line. But, part of, I think, an argument has been in a lot of, journalism versus blog versus opinion journalism debates, an argument has been, look, we all have biases as long as you're upfront about them and people know where you as a reporter are coming from. It's not a question of, can I trust this person? You make your own judgment based on their reporting and based on what you know about that person's background, how you take in the information he or she provides. And you want to write off Dave Weigel now and not go to his blog on the Washington Post, don't go to it. But it's not. Right. But it's not necessarily abhorrent to that he did this, and that he did this. He did it on Twitter. He didn't whisper it at a cocktail party. It's public, and you can take it for what it is.
Right, and I think actually the fact that he's at the Post is what makes this an issue.
And I think there's a question whether he violates Post policy, which is a separate issue.
Right, and I looked at Matt's write-up on Post policy, and it's not clear to me whether Dave exactly violated it. He might have, he might not have. I don't feel like I'm qualified to comment on that. But I do think the fact that he's at the Post and in this sort of fairly prominent position is what has made this an issue. But with the Post hiring a stable of bloggers, the Politico did that piece on sort of on how the Post is beefing up on so-called liberal bloggers, although I don't, again, think it's necessarily fair to classify Dave as a liberal.
And Ezra made that point himself in his Ezra Klein, right. Who responded to that Politico piece on his own Washington Post blog, saying it's not a shift to liberalism on the side, it's a shift towards people that can do analysis on the fly within the news cycle and not in a week or a month out approach the way a lot of magazines have done in the past.
And another part of Ezra's point was that the people who right now are specializing in that are people who work at some of the smaller magazines, and that's what the smaller magazines have really been pushing recently. And the smaller magazines, though, also tend to be a little scrappier and a little more sort of willing to allow their writers to say, call people bigots if that's what they think. Right. And so Dave, having come from the Washington Independent and Reason, sort of has that culture and that writing style. And the other thing is he was doing this on Twitter, which is yet sort of another layer removed from your daily blogging. And so it is sort of an interesting, broader media question about how these big media institutions like the Washington Post are gonna have to change or react to the fact that, look, if they're going to bring these people in from the smaller magazine cultures, are they going to expect them to then hew to the Post's sort of more formal traditional culture, or are you going to say, look, what these people did at their smaller publications was actually what we value, and we're just going to let you continue to do exactly the same thing? And I don't think that question has been fully answered yet, but we will see in the next couple of years.
I don't think we've seen the Post slap Weigel for this yet.
No, not at all. They've basically let him go, as far as I can tell. I don't know whether the apology was something his editor said you need to write something like this, whether he was just told you need to write a response or you need to use the word apologize.
Right.
That may have been the case, but it at least whatever it was behind the scenes, if there was anything. We don't know that there was anything at all. But it's been interesting to see the Post sort of, not actually say anything in this case.
Right. They didn't say Weigel violated our policy, and he's been told that.
He is still there, and as far as I know, they don't have any plans to change that.
Right.
Which I'm glad about.
And I wouldn't be surprised if whatever traffic he brings in is a factor in that decision. I imagine he's getting a good amount of traction for it because he's doing reporting that I think no one else is doing.
Yes, I agree. I think his reporting is important and useful, and the world is a better place for it.
So another issue that was roiling the conservative blogosphere this week, and this is something that Matt and I talked about a couple weeks ago, this whole, I know I'm pronouncing this wrong, epistemic closure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pronouncing it wrong, aren't I?
Epistemic closure, I believe.
Thank you very much.
So the T.
We talked about the flare-up between Jim Manzi and Mark Levine. My pronunciation is totally bad
It's
today.
one of those two. I have not actually ever listened to his radio show.
Oh my goodness! Another scandalous confession here.
I read him at the corner when he posts there, but I don't make a habit of listening to. Yeah.
So we talked about how that was Manzi was getting a pretty decent beatdown amongst other conservative bloggers for challenging Levine's handling of the facts, if you will. And so we had another flare up this week. Why don't you give the overview of this?
Well, so the interesting thing here is that it wasn't actually a flare-up, but a widespread agreement between a couple of parties who you wouldn't normally expect to agree. The thing that sort of started this was an article by Kevin Williamson, who is, I believe, the deputy managing editor of the National Review's print edition, basically tearing down the traditional GOP, the dogma that's long stood in the GOP that tax cuts pay for themselves, and saying that it may happen very occasionally, but it is not at all the norm, and politicians who claim this are just simply wrong. That at best, according to the CBO, you might get about 30 cents on the dollar back, but that is a best case scenario, and that Republicans should basically stop abusing the old Laffer curve idea that if you cut taxes, it doesn't cut government revenue because the tax cuts increase growth and therefore there's more tax revenue to be collected. And so this was actually a pretty big admission because so many Republicans have run and won on this line that you can cut taxes and it doesn't matter to government revenue because government revenue stays the same. Right. And so National Review running a long and detailed piece on this by one of their staff editors was kind of a big deal. And you actually had Ross Douthat, I don't know if you want to call him a big government conservative, but certainly a conservative more comfortable with increasing tax rates than most. Veronique DeRougy, a fairly ferocious, budget-focused libertarian policy wonk at the Mercatus Center, and Jonathan Chait, a liberal who spends most of his efforts making fun of conservatives, particularly on economic issues, for sort of not getting it, not being policy savvy. All of them sort of came together and agreed, wow, this is actually a big step for bringing conservative policy types into reality. And you had actually Cato as well. I believe it was Dan Mitchell, who does tax policy at Cato, wrote a post being very complimentary of the article. And so it's a really interesting piece. I'd actually recommend everyone read it.
There was no blowback. There was no one was trying to.
Well, there was no blowback. But what Chait pointed out was that there wasn't a lot of talk about this on the corner. Veronique DeRougy, the libertarian I mentioned, said, "Good job. This is a great piece." And other than that, there hasn't been a huge amount. If there was some today, Thursday, I missed it. But now, I don't think that's necessarily a sign that there's a lot of antipathy towards it, towards this idea and towards this piece from National Review. After all, it was National Review who published the piece to begin with. I'm not sure that they need to spend a lot of time giving themselves high fives for publishing something like this. But it was an interesting thing to see folks like DeRougy, Douthat, and Chait all come together and say, yeah, actually, this is right. And for conservatives to take this step to say, look, a lot of our politicians have been running on this line, and it's wrong. It just doesn't stand up. And so as far as bringing themselves out of the epistemic closure loop. I think this was an incredibly admirable thing for National Review to do and to publish. It was a great, very well written, very, very smart piece on Williamson's part, saying, it's not impossible that could happen in some instances, but in basically all the instances that we talk about in all sort of contemporary tax policy instances, it's not an issue.
Well, I guess the real...
And so seeing that, but I'm a little more curious to see what the liberal side of what the liberal reaction, aside from Chait's, is. Are they going to be dismissive of this, and how will this factor in? How will this change the debates if this becomes more widely accepted? How will that actually change the debates?
Well, I think there's a big if it becomes widely accepted, amongst Republican Party politicians, that they were no longer going to maintain the magic supply side line, that would probably have to prompt some adjustment in rhetoric from the left. I think today, I don't think that the Williamson piece got a lot of attention on the left outside of Chait. And you may see a dynamic maybe different than what happened to Manzi, where he got an active beatdown. You might see Williamson just get kind of ignored by even the guy, some plots from a few corners, that his advice is not embraced. And I mean, David Stockman did the same thing, who was in Reagan's cabinet, to say that the supply side line was ridiculous.
Right.
And
right. No,
that was 30 years ago.
Williamson did a great job in that he actually got Art Laffer, the guy for whom the Laffer curve is named, to say, yeah, this idea has been totally abused. and when you get the person who invents the idea and for whom it's named to sign on to your basic point, then it becomes a lot harder to go after the piece in the way that Manzi's.
I wish logic always worked that way in political discourse. But often it does not. And look, I think there's a dynamic on the left here. I think the whole epistemic closure thing is far more pronounced on the right than the left. But I do think there's some elements on the left. Take, for example, within the financial reform debate, when Paul Krugman, when he writes stuff about stimulus, job creation, he is treated by almost everyone on the left as being, unassailable. He took a position on financial reform that was a little more nuanced, saying, it's not really about the size of the banks, it's more about regulation. And because he took that position, whereas a lot of the energy on the left is about breaking up the banks,
right.
All the expert du jour is now Simon Johnson.
Right.
Who was an MIT prof, former IMF chief economist. He wrote a big essay in The Atlantic several months back, really going after the nexus of Wall Street and Washington, and has since launched a popular blog, gets a lot of Huffington Post attention, and everything Simon Johnson says is gospel about breaking up the banks, and what Krugman says is not outright attacked, it's just not paid attention to as much. So it's very possible that with Williamson here, that let's just pretend he didn't write that and go about doing what we've been doing about taxes.
Right. Although, ideally, I think what would happen here, what one would hope, is that, and this was part of Williamson's point, is that it will change the debate to be not simply about tax cuts, and all you really need to be a conservative is to support tax cuts, but also to be about spending and to be serious about it, because there are very few Republicans who are at all serious about spending. That Republicans talk a lot about it, and very few of them have any kind of plan to actually do anything serious about spending. Paul Ryan's plan is the only thing even close that I'm aware of, and
the party did not fully coalesce around.
Yeah, well, I believe he had a total of 9 co-sponsors, and most of the leadership basically said, that's nice, but kind of backed away. Right. I have an article about this in the new issue of Reason, and sort of looking at why the Republican Party, he put forward a plan that will balance the budget in 2063, not exactly like a crazy radical we're going to do it tomorrow kind of thing, and the Republican Party wouldn't even sign up for that by and large. Certainly the leadership was just not interested, and but if if Republicans start, sort of agreeing that, yeah, you can't just cut taxes and the revenue side will stay the same, but in fact taxes and spending are sort of are connected more than Republicans really want to admit these days. It might force them to be a little more serious in their spending proposals and a little more honest about what you actually have to do to maintain the tax rates that they want to maintain.
The proof of the pudding will be: does anyone prominent beyond Ryan start itemizing? This is what I would cut. This is how I. This is. I don't just say I'm going to shrink the size of government. This is what I would shrink. This is what I would stop doing.
Right, and I, as a libertarian who is probably a little more radical than most Republicans on government spending and sort of the size of government issues, I would very much like to see that. I would like to see lists of things that can and should be cut, and I think that that Republicans at some point are going to sort of have to stand behind, if they're going to continue down the small government let's not tax people road, they're going to have to stand behind some spending cuts that make them that allow them to also claim the mantle of fiscal responsibility, because tax cuts without spending cuts are as fiscally irresponsible as anything that, as the worst of what Democrats are proposing, and perhaps more so in some cases.
Well, speaking of fiscal austerity and shrinking government, there were some varying reactions to a recent Mark Penn piece about where the electoral middle is. Why don't you set that up?
Sure. So Mark Penn had an op-ed in the Washington Post. This is Mark Penn of Microtrends fame. If you haven't read Ezra Klein's
you really say
Microtrends
fame? Is it really famous?
Well, I don't know. It's famous amongst bloggers, I guess. Although that probably means it's very much not famous. But if you haven't read Ezra Klein's classic review of his book, it's one of the best takedowns I have ever read. But Mark Penn, former big-time advisor to Hillary Clinton, had an op-ed in the Washington Post suggesting that people who were socially liberal and fiscally conservative, broadly construed, were being left out of current political debates, and that the political environment was now ripe for a third-party contender in the presidential races. And he said, he concluded his piece with a line: "It may not happen in 2012, but one of the next 3 presidential elections is likely to feature a major new player under a new banner." And John Chait responded to this, saying that the theme of Penn's op-ed is that the parties are abandoning the center, and it's likely that a third party, presumably occupying the vast ideological gulf between Olympia Snowe and Ben Nelson, will emerge to challenge Democrats and Republicans. I think Chait got Penn right a lot when he sort of accused Penn of basically saying, well, eventually everything will come to support the politics that I agree with, and manipulating all the data to end up in what I've called the Doherty doctrine, after my friend Michael Brennan Doherty, who, when he said basically that a lot of politics in Washington comes down to, if my party were more like me, it would be better off. It's worse because it's like you.
Isn't that pretty much all of blogging?
Well, this is that may be true,
or all of centrist column writing as well.
Yes, certainly all of broderism and much of the Washington Post's, at least their traditional editorial page. But I'm not sure that Chait was right in identifying the Penn sweet spot as the ideological gulf between Olympia Snowe and Ben Nelson. At least in part because I'm not sure you can say that Olympia Snowe or Ben Nelson are actually ideological. I mean, what do either of them believe in?
Well, that's what's sort of interesting. I mean, I think there's definitely an ideology of broderism. There's definitely a fiscal austerity ideology that they pawn off as being in the middle, but it's really just another ideological viewpoint. Whereas you look at the so-called Senate centrist of Nelson and Snowe, Collins and Specter and others, there's really no rhyme or reason to their actions. It's a total mishmash.
It's whatever might be good for me next month, and
I'm not even
or
sure
next
it's that
election
smart.
cycle. I mean, what I get, no. If you can figure out Olympia Snow and Ben Nelson, if you can come up with a coherent theory of them, you will be famous. I've certainly never been able to do it.
But they definitely are always chasing what they think is the middle, but there seems to be no actual intellectual underpinning to anything that they do.
It's like string theory, trying to figure out, I mean, if you can figure out like the thing that underlies all their actions. Yeah, I don't know. I can't figure them out either. So I'm not sure I quite agree with Chait in that, although I certainly agree that Penn has been manipulating, it sort of manipulates the data to get to the idea that he wants. But
I'd say his partner, Doug Schoen, has done a lot of the same in his recent columns with Pat Goodell. I've seen a lot of cherry picking of poll numbers to advance a similar point.
The question that Kevin Drum alluded to on Twitter, which is how I found both the Chait piece and the and Penn, was why is Mark Penn still? I mean, why does he have influence? What does he say? I mean, I guess he sort of scratches a certain centrist Ben Nelson-y, Olympia Snowy itch that some people have. I don't know.
I'm not sure he has influence anymore. I mean, his influence.
But he still gets. But he still runs a major consulting firm. He still gets his op-eds that say not really much of anything and are not convincing, published in the Washington Post. And it's this bizarre, And he was, and the last election cycle, he was a top advisor to Hillary Clinton.
But it's post Clinton where I think his stock considerably dropped. I mean, he had stock, previous to the Hillary Clinton campaign because he was seen as one of the, brainiacs behind a successful Bill Clinton presidency. But because the Hillary Clinton campaign was such a disaster and so much was put at Penn's feet, I mean, he can get his op-eds placed, and I'm sure his PR business does very well. But I don't think he moves political conversation in the way that he did, 2 years ago.
Probably not. I don't know. I guess in this, I'm certainly with the liberals. We're all better off that someone who trusted Mark Penn that much did not end up winning the presidency, or at least with some of the liberals. I guess there's still Hillary Clinton.
Now there was a libertarian take on Penn's piece too. Yes.
Yes. So David Bose, a vice president at the Cato Institute, actually had found a lot to like in it. And he sort of arguing that what Penn was talking about was libertarian-leaning voters, broadly defined, socially liberal and fiscally conservative. And David Bose, along with David Kirby, has done a fair bit of work arguing, looking at the polling data and arguing that that libertarian-leaning voters, broadly defined, actually make up a substantial chunk of the electorate. Somewhere, I believe it's around 12 or 14%. I forget the exact number. And so he wrote that libertarian-leaning voters are a large swing vote, and they do indeed find problems with both parties, but was fairly skeptical, I think rightly so, about Penn's idea that that this broad libertarian coalition is going to result in something like a third party, that actually, a successful third party anyway. That we saw even with somebody who like Ron Paul, who inspired a lot of devotion. That campaign didn't go all that far. Raised a lot more money than anybody expected, but voting wise, it really did attract a huge number of people.
I mean, there's always the country, the American politics is much more complex than a two-party system might indicate. I mean, any country has the potential for a multi-party system because people have a smorgasbord of views, but it's hard to get any new party off the ground. The people that tend to try to lead it tend to be crazy. Ron Paul, Ross Perot, etc. Right. I speak as a former Ross Perot voter.
Or at least a little kooky. Right. They've got to have I
mean, Perot was crazy, but had $1 billion.
Inflated sense of themselves. Right. And that was actually part of Bose's point was that, I mean, look, between the regulations and sort of the barriers to the other barriers to entry and the financials on this, it's very, very difficult to launch a third party, no matter what the political situation is. And certainly Penn on this is sort of, well, I think Penn is the crazy one here.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, circumstances can materialize with people are frustrated with. I mean, there's always going to be a certain level of frustration with people in power because people are human and imperfect and can't solve every single problem.
Right.
If someone competent came along who was going to do mixing and matching of certain things and had a good signature idea, was going to handle a problem in a straightforward way, and got a lot of money behind that person, sure, things can happen.
Yeah. No, and this is where I actually really agree with David Bose, is that whether or not there's a huge number of libertarians in the electorate, there are a huge number of people who are not well served by the two-party system. On the other hand, I'm not sure that the American political system is built to do anything about that. I mean, the parties are going to sort of shift to try to capture their sort of slim majorities and do what they can to get that 51 or 52%. And that's just going to leave a lot multi kind of stuck without a party that really represents them.
You look at any multi-party country. I mean, what America essentially has is a multi-party system. Just the coalitions are already kind of pre-shaped.
With built-in wrappers.
Right. I mean, if you broke them up, you could break up the Democratic Party into probably 3 or 4 parties. But once they got to Congress, they'd have to get back together, and they're going to try to pass anything. So what's the difference?
Right, and actually, as far as Bose goes, his argument is that the libertarian vote is big enough that it could, in theory, swing elections if it were genuinely not committed to one party. And while I really like that idea,
it is generally not committed to one party.
But sure.
So there's a strain in the public that is. I mean, everyone is a mix of wanting good government and being skeptical that good government is possible. And to the extent that people have a skeptical side, I mean, that constituency does swing back and forth.
Sure, there are. That's not to say that there aren't swing voters or aren't voters who are committed, who aren't committed to a party. But I forget who it was who was noting this the other day. But if you look at how independent voters, so-called independent voters, vote, many of them, I believe a majority, actually tend to vote with one party more or less as much as people who say that they are actually Republicans or Democrats. So the whole idea that there's this large independent bloc that is easily gettable by politicians, I think it's at least a little bit overstated. If there's the libertarian bloc, which I very much would like to see, it would be hard to get libertarians in particular to vote together. And this is, I mean, libertarians. You'll find liberal libertarians and conservative libertarians and totally unclassifiable libertarians and trying to figure out sort of, okay, we're going to act as a bloc. How would you do that? Well, with a group like libertarians, it would be very difficult, much as I'm sympathetic to the idea and wish it were possible.
Well, one last thing briefly before we wrap things up. Reason posted, this is Radley Balco, who's been on the beat of potentially unconstitutional, aggressive police actions, posted a video of a drug raid inside someone's home where they wrongly assumed that the house had a drug dealer inside. In fact, it was someone who just was a recreational user of marijuana, at least as far as what Balco has described it as. And so I actually hadn't seen this video until you shared it with me. And I was struck by it had nearly 200,000 YouTube views and only been posted, I think, for a few days. Do you know how this video got such attention so fast?
I believe it was. We've actually at Reason had our servers nearly shut down over the past day from Radley's posting of it. And so I believe that was a large part of it. It's been one of the top hits on Dig. I believe it's got more than 4,000. But it's one of those issues where you at least wish that when you watch this thing, it's fairly horrific. The dog is killed in front of. So what you see is a helmet cam from a SWAT officer who's part of a SWAT team that is kicking down the door and invading a home in what appears to be a fairly sedate middle class neighborhood, pinning the man, the father, a father to the ground. You hear gunshots and squeals and barking from dogs because. There are two dogs who get shot by the SWAT team. One of which is a pit bull, and the cops claim you don't see this on the video, so it's impossible to verify. But the cops claim that the pit bull was acting aggressively toward them. But I think it's also entirely possible that acting aggressive meant barking, which is kind of what you would expect a family dog to do when, a half dozen guys in riot gear burst into your home. And this is all done in front of the man's wife and child. It's incredibly disturbing. It's the sort of, abuse of government power that I feel like you ought to have a cross-section of conservatives, liberals, and libertarians sort of decrying. And it really, to me, it drives home what the costs of our drug war are. And I feel like, to me, this is the sort of thing that ought to be that conservatives ought to be who support the drug war really ought to have to deal with, and because it's not about dealers and it's not about all the other stuff. These are the costs that we're incurring, and this is what we're seeing in our fairly nice middle class neighborhoods. Is that we get SWAT officers breaking down doors and shooting people's pets for.
Now, how did
perhaps no great reason?
Now, how did Balco get a hold of this video?
I am not sure. I actually
he's not revealed his methods to you.
I have seen the video. I saw his reporting on the initial story in February, and the video just popped up. It may be out. I may have simply overlooked it. I've been a little bit busy over the last couple of days, so I got a chance to watch the video, but not do a huge amount of in-depth looking at it, and have not spoken to Radley since. But the SWAT, the chief of police in the town, has said we're looking into this, but the shooting of the dogs was justified because they were being aggressive, and that we execute. His claim is that the guy probably was a dealer, but that they executed the warrant too late. They executed it apparently 8 days after they got the warrant. They have a 10-day window in which they can execute it. So the larger amount of pot that they believed was there was disposed of. But
so there are some facts in dispute.
That's the claim that has come out, but still, I mean, here is a suburban home with a small child in it, and you've got cops in military gear bursting in with guns and shooting family pets. There's no resistance from the family. There's nothing. And this is over whether it's even if it had been a slightly larger amount of pot. Really, this is what we get. Anyway,
this issue is still roiling the community that this happened in.
Yeah. They've had to respond to this because of the attention the video has gotten.
Well, interesting to see if YouTubing of SWAT team helmet cams can actually affect public policy.
One hopes. I think this is one place where cameras, where government cameras are actually a very good thing.
Oh, the irony. Well, Peter, it's been great to talk to you.
It's been very nice talking to you as well. Thank you for having me on.
Hopefully we can have you back.
Thank you so much, Bill.
All right, have a great day.
You too.
Bye.